This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website.
All right, I have to begin with a few solemn words about John Coffin. The Institutes of the School of Advanced Study host John Coffin Memorial events on behalf of the colleges of the University of London in fulfilment of a gift by Mr. Coffin's son, Arthur Charles Coffin. Almost nothing has been coordinated in the institutional memory of the university about either John Coffin or his son, although it was known that Arthur Charles Coffin had been Chief Education Officer in Bradford and that before the Second World War he had close connections with the university. This is an uplifting story. Recent research has, however, revealed that John Coffin was a journeyman blacksmith in the West Country residing in Dorchester. On the 30th of March 1868, his wife, Mary Ann, gave birth to a son and thereafter made her mark on the birth certificate. In other words, she had no writing literacy. Arthur Charles Coffin became an external student of the University of London, graduated with a pass degree in arts in 1889, and he retired as Inspector of Education to Stony Down, Dorset, and died aged 88 in July 1956, leaving his residual estate of £27,000 to the university in 1957. Now, there's evidently more to be found out about this man, but the facts thus far exemplify the founding intentions of the University of London to widen access to tertiary education as far as possible. And now I'm going to quote now from what is really the sole institutional memory of John Coffin. Mr. Coffin was concerned that, in the growing intensity of specialisation in modern times, we should not lose sight of music, the arts, and what he termed the cultural aspects of education, and not the least of good general teaching on a sound religious basis. In addition to a part of the bequest devoted to lectures in Christian ethics, history, literature and science, other parts are earmarked for literary readings or prose or poetry, chamber concerts or recitals, and for the publication of reports by the Institute of Education. Mr. Coffin further states in his will that he desired each event to be announced as part of the John Coffin Memorial, and it therefore appears likely that the bequest is in memory of his father. So there you are, there's a sort of testimony to education and social mobility in the 20th century. Now, this is, I think, the sixth London Irish Studies lecture since we began with Column to Bean on Beckett's Irish Voices in 2007. This year, it's the turn of history, and the organisers, who are Ben Levitas, Claire Wills and myself, came up with a name very quickly, Cormac Gráda, who's Professor Emeritus in UCD's School of Economics. And it took us a little longer to decide on a topic, because Cormac offered us three options to choose from. One, Irish immigration. Two, the end of famine in Ireland and elsewhere. And three, the macabre subject, and this was actually my preference, I have to confess, since I've spent several years reading Swift, the macabre subject of famine cannibalism, which he cautioned some might find inappropriate. And actually, on reading what you have said about this already, that was true. This gives some indication of the astonishing range of his research interests, but just some indication. He's well known to many people here as the author of major books, including 1988, Ireland Before and After the Famine, Explorations in Economic History, 1800 to 1930, 1994, Ireland, A New Economic History, 1780 to 1939. 1997, A Rocky Road, The Irish Economy Since Independence, which goes up to the Celtic Tiger, or the Economic Greyhound, is Cormac's preferred metaphor. 1997, Black 47 and Beyond. The Great Irish Famine in History, Economy and Memory, which many reviewers thought was the best book to come out of the 1990s and the whole 150th anniversary commemorations of the famine. And then more recently, 2006, Jewish Ireland in the Age of Joyce, and 2009, Famine, A Short History. All of these works are distinguished by their impressive scope and by the clarity and judiciousness of the writing, by Cormac's ability to draw on an extraordinary range of qualitative and quantitative evidence, by the ease with which he can move from hardcore cliometrics to social and cultural history. Another striking feature, I think, is the increasingly global character of his work, which has in recent years included discussions of China, India, Finland, and Sudan, many other places, and the way in which his pioneering comparative studies have accentuated the scale and significance of the Great Famine in world history rather than diminishing it. Cormac's also the author or co-author of dozens of important articles that ask questions like how many Irish people were there in the 18th and 19th century, how many and what kinds of Irish people emigrated and what the resulting loss was to Ireland, how many died during the famine and what they died from, how we can measure living standards in Ireland before the famine, how fertility patterns differed between Ireland and Irish America, between North and South, between Protestants and Catholics in the North, and also the distinctive demography of Dublin's Jewish households. And, of course, how much taller 19th century Irish men were than their English counterparts. And when you reflect on this selection of his publications, which is by no means exhaustive, I think you find yourself hard-pressed to think of other scholars who have taught us so much, not only about the big social and economic transformations in Ireland in the last 2 centuries, but also, I think, about the experiences of ordinary people, ordinary Irish people, particularly in the long 19th century. And as you can see, I lost the argument on the choice of paper because this evening he is speaking to the title, Because She Never Let Them In, Irish Immigration a Century Ago and Today. Cormac, thank you.
First of all, Ian, thanks so much for your kind words. I'm delighted to have been asked to give this prestigious lecture. It's not often that I get asked to give lectures like this. I hope John Coffin, wherever he is, will appreciate what I'm going to say. And I have a paper which I'm going to ad-lib from, and I have a few slides as well to help me on the way. But I'm going to be talking first of all about Irish immigration a century ago or so, and then the second part of the paper is going to be about very recent Irish immigration aspects of that anyway. Of course, until a decade or so ago, Ireland was a land of emigration, not immigration. Since the famine, both the broad contours of and short-term fluctuations in Irish population trends were determined by net immigration, not by natural increase. And Ireland was rather unusual in that. And of course, it was this also that made Ireland uniquely among European countries lose population for over a century. A lot has been written on the ramifications of that emigration, both for Ireland and for host countries. But over the past decade or so, it is immigration that has loomed largest in Ireland. In 1991, the number of Irish residents born outside the Republic numbered somewhat over 200,000, or 6% of the total population, and only 40,000 of those had been born outside the UK or the US. 2 decades later, in 2011, the foreign-born numbered over 750,000, or 1 in 6 of the total, and nearly 500,000 of those were born outside the UK. The huge rise in the numbers of residents of East European origin, and especially the influx from Poland, are often highlighted. But between 2002 and 2011, the number of African-born residents doubled to over 50,000, and that of Asian-born residents almost trebled to nearly 80,000. Not only was the influx unprecedented on Paddy's green shamrock shore, it was also massive in relative, not in absolute terms, of course, by present-day European standards. So this is simply looking at Irish immigration in comparative perspective, but controlling for population size. And it is rather impressive. Of course, now with the passing of the Celtic Tiger, emigration looms large again. In the year ending April 2012, over 87,000 left, more than half of them Irish, the rest non-nationals seeking greener pastures elsewhere. And, you get two distinct patterns. This is Irish, the immigration of Irish nationals, and this is of the EU12, the Poles, the people from the Baltic countries, and so on. A century ago, a much smaller immigration was the spark for a famous passage in the Nestor episode in Ulysses, and I'd read it. Mr. Deasy halted, breathing hard and swallowing his breath. I just wanted to say, he said, Ireland, they say, has the honour of being the only country which never persecuted the Jews. Do you know that? No. And do you know why? He frowned sternly on the bright air. Why, sir? Stephen asked, beginning to smile. Because she never let them in, Mr. Deasy said solemnly. Now, the passage is interesting for a few reasons. One, for the literates, is that Stephen's bigoted companion, Garrett Deasy, with his angry white moustache, was not a Catholic Dubliner, but a Northern Protestant. He was, if you like, the Protestant citizen in Ulysses. But a second and much more important reason is that Ireland did let them in. In 1904, there were still virtually no restrictions on immigration into Ireland or anywhere else in the UK, although hostility in Britain to the immigration of people seen as paupers and criminals led to the Aliens Act of 1905. That legislation was directed chiefly against East European Jews. A third reason why Deasy's claim, to which I shall return, is interesting is that it is an exaggeration to say that Ireland persecuted the Jews. A more interesting question is, why did the Jews want to settle in Ireland at a time when tens of thousands of others were leaving it? Why didn't they go elsewhere? And one answer is that for the most part, they did. Ireland's Jewish population was always minuscule. We don't have data on flows, but between the late 1860s and the Great War, Ireland's stock of non-UK and non-American born residents fell from a minuscule 6,800 in 1861 to 6,100, or 0.14% of the population in 1911. In 1911, Russian-born Jews accounted for almost 1/3 of the total, and there were over 5,000 people professing the Jewish religion. So these would be, by and large, the immigrants and their families. Thanks in large part to one Leopold Bloom, the Jewish immigration is well documented. Less is known about a much smaller, but more or less contemporaneous immigration from Italy. On the eve of the Great War, Ireland's Italian community numbered about 400. Excluding transient sailors, there were 171 Italians in 1851, 340 in 1891, and just short of 300 in 1901. Thanks to the relatively new technique of web scraping, it is not difficult to construct a profile of the small Italian community in 1851. But let me just explain for a minute. When I worked on the Jewish community, I spent a lot of time in the National Archives taking down coding information from the enumeration sheets. You do it manually. But now, what took me and a guy who was working for me weeks to do can be done within a day or two through web scraping. And because I did it the way I did, my study concentrated on where there is that heavy concentration south of the Liffey, and just inside the Grand Canal. And the reason was that I had a good idea of what streets to look for. But finding these other people would have been, at that time, like looking for a needle in a haystack. You'd have to go through an enormous amount of stuff trying to find these scattered Jewish immigrants. But this is done thanks to web scraping by a graduate student in UCLA now. So he again had access to the information, and he could immediately plot the whole lot. And so the work I'm doing on Italy is using this newer approach. Now, the two migrations had some things in common. They're both very small. Both Jews and Italians were subject to some resentment and abuse, but not enough to prevent them from staying and making a decent living in Ireland. The treatment meted out to the Jews has been the focus of a good deal of research. But there was hostility to the Italians also, albeit of a different kind from various quarters. Neighbours sometimes resented the Italians' fish and chip shops and ice cream parlours for the noisy, unruly custom they attracted. For example, in the 1900s, the vicar of St. Anne's on Dawson Street objected to Edmund Caveri's fish and chip shop on nearby South Ann Street for what were described as the improper characters it attracted. And Celeste Macari in Derry was fined for allowing gaming on his premises. In Belfast, Italians were vulnerable to sectarian attacks, as when in December 1910 a crowd of youths on their way down the Shankill Road stoned the window of an Italian shopfront near Carrick Hill. One of the occupants fired a shot into the crowd in reply, and this resulted in what was described as a regular vendetta in Belfast, with the smashing of the windows of virtually every Italian shop in the south and west of the city. A year and a half later, in July 1912, which was a time of heightened communal tension, Italian-run ice cream shops in Belfast were again the target of gangs composed of youths and mill girls. In both communities later, there was a shared belief or memory that the migrations had been, in part anyway, accidental. The story goes that Giuseppe or Joseph Cervi, who is credited with having introduced Dubliners to fish and chips, disembarked from an American ship in Cove in the late 1880s, convinced he was in New York. From there, and I'm citing a source, made his way to Dublin on foot, and having worked for some time for an Italian stonemason called Bassi, he bought a cart from which he would sell chips. Another account reports that Cervi, and I quote, began by selling chips from a stall in the street on a spot where Pierce Street Fire Station now is. And this is Cervi's shop. It states that he got the idea from a Russian who used to run a potato stall on Tara Street, but adds that he had also seen chips in England and decided to launch them on the Irish. The shop that the illiterate Giuseppe Cervi opened, and almost across the street from the old Queen's Theatre, was still operated by his grandchildren in 1960. Now, similar themes crop up in Jewish oral accounts, and I describe these in the book Ian mentioned. Gerald Goldberg, son of an immigrant Litvak, described the arrival of Jews in Cork as accidental. Reaching the port of Queenstown, they were duped by the colloquial claim that America was the next parish. Another more colourful version of this tale recounts that calls of Cork were mistaken for New York, prompting befuddled, bedraggled, wandering Jews to disembark in Queenstown. But specialists on migration dismiss such tales about accidental destinations. And so there is no need to wonder why Giuseppe Cervi believed Queenstown was New York. Indeed, the likelihood that he had spent some time in England before coming to Ireland begs the question why he should have landed in Queenstown in the first place. Similarly, if Cervi learned from a Russian, and therefore possibly Jewish immigrant, it is said that some of the early Jewish immigrants in Dublin took to selling holy pictures after seeing Italians producing them. And one story, which I owe to the late Asher Benson, mentions a Jewish family discovering a shed full of pictures and statues in the backyard of a newly occupied house on the South Circular Road and starting off trade in that way. And other cameos reveal curious parallels. Thus, in May 1908, a Roscommon man got a month's hard labour for assaulting an Italian decorator named Brentani with a Thatcher's knife. His excuse was that Brentani refused to drink with him. This recalls an incident in Cork 2 decades earlier when a Trades Council delegate complained in the course of an anti-Semitic tirade that local Jews would not, and I quote, eat or shake hands with a Christian. And there is a sense that sometimes otherness was a two-way street. In both communities, the migrations had been associated in communal memory with a small place in the home country. The tiny village of Akmayan, or nowadays Akmane, for the Jews. This is the Jewish cemetery in Akmane, which is in northwestern Lithuania. What was left of the population in the 1943-44 was almost completely wiped out in the Holocaust. And then for the Italians, Lazio's Val di Camino, about 100 kilometers from Rome, and in particular the small community of Castellatico, which has a population of about 700 today. The link with Castellatico would seem to find further corroboration in the remarkably high proportion of Italians, nearly 4 in every 5 in Ireland in the mid-1980s, who had been born in the region of Lazio. Next in importance of Italy's 18 regions came Lombardy, which accounted for only 72 of the total of 2,300 Italian-born residents. Yet this exaggerates the Casalese component in Italian immigration in the interim. In 1911, Ireland contained, like I said, about 400 immigrants of Italian stock. Their surnames imply that they were a varied bunch. As in Ireland, surveys are a good predictor of where people are from in Italy, or were 100 years ago. So the Italians were by no means exclusively from Castellatico. Interestingly, 93 of the 104 of those identified as Castellaticans by their surnames lived in County Antrim or in the neighbouring counties of Down and Armagh. The 1911 census suggests that all of Ireland's 23 Fuscos then lived in Belfast, as did all but 2 of the 44 Fortes. Only a dozen with common Castellese surnames, including the Cervis, of course, lived in Dublin. Dublin's Italians were more likely to have Tuscan connections a century ago. They included, of course, Joseph Patrick Nanetti, MP, son of a sculptor and one-time Lord Mayor of Dublin. Those who settled in Belfast formed their own little ghetto, much like the Jews did in Belfast and to a greater extent in Dublin. But none of these were ghettos in the literal sense, any more than Dublin's Little Jerusalem because in all of them the immigrants lived cheek by jowl with locals. A century or so ago, Belfast was a much more dynamic place than Dublin. And one of the puzzles about the Jewish immigration, at the outset anyway, was why did it concentrate on Dublin? The Italians there were more Italians in Belfast in 1911 than in Dublin, and that seems to fit. But the answer, I think, to the question is that in both cases the immigrants are catering for niches. And as the Weekly Irish Times noted of what were called the Jewish foreigners, with his inherent alertness, he soon discovered that the very poverty of the people offered him promises of mutual benefit. He at once set himself out to supply the poor Irishman and woman with such necessities and luxuries which they could never procure unless he, the Jew, formed the intermediary. So, paradoxically, as it were, it was Dublin's poverty that created a niche for the kind of trade the Jewish immigrants specialized in. So they were peddlers, they sold goods on credit through the so-called weekly system, and they also engaged in money lending, whereas the Italians specialized successively in organ grinding, ice cream and confectionery, and fish and chips. The communities also, for a few years anyway, had a street in common. Members of the Dublin Metropolitan Police found accommodation for some of the first Litvak settlers in a tenement next to the police station in Chancery Lane, Dublin the Liberties. This would have been in the early 1870s. There they lived in what was described in one source as a little square wherein stood the police station, joining the other foreigners, Italian organ grinders, bear leaders, one-man band operators, and makers of small, cheap plaster casts of the saints of the Catholic Church. By the 1870s, Chancery Lane, originally a small but elegant street, was already in a state of dilapidation. The Jews left quickly for what would eventually come to be known as Little Jerusalem, but many of the Italians stayed on. And there were almost as many of them and their Irish-born families in 1911 as there had been in 1901, about 50 in each case. In 1911, Ireland had 12 Italian-born organ grinders or musicians, 5, again, judging by surnames from Casalatico, and 7 from elsewhere. This emblematic employment had long been associated with Italian immigrants. The number of Italian-born musicians recorded in the census, however, fell over time. There were 42 of them in 1891. The organ grinders emerge in press cameos such as that of the murder in February 1841 of organ grinder Domenico Garibaldo by the Dodder in Rathfarnham, or the court case taken in May 1888 by a woman named Marcella, wife of an organ grinder, against another organ grinder, appropriately named Violante, and his wife, which was attended by about a dozen from what might be called the Italian colony. Signora Marcella's claim that she was assaulted by Violante and his wife was countered by Signora Violante's insistence, backed by several witnesses, that it was Marcella who had started the fighting. An amusing gloss on organ grinders is given by the story of 2 who were charged in 1904 with annoying the well-known writer George Moore by playing outside his house in Upmarket, Ely Place, and refusing to desist when asked to do so. Moore complained that the noise was intolerable, but one of the musicians protested that he left when he had finished his tune and promised not to play outside Moore's house anymore. In any case, the Italians posted a bond to desist from what was seen as a deliberate persecution. For several decades, the organ grinders held a New Year's concert in Chancery Lane. In 1884, this involved over a dozen organs being wheeled into the thoroughfare, and as 12 o'clock struck, the men began to grind as many different airs. Other musicians joined in, generating what was described in the Irish Times as a hideous cacophony of sound, a big crowd and much laughter and amusement, but no disorder. A decade later, this boisterous annual event was on the wane, although the Italians, dressed in their picturesque native costumes, appeared at the windows and doors of the houses with smiling faces and cheery words of salutations for the passers-by. On New Year's Day 1901, the Times rather lamented the serenading crowds and the sounds of squealing instruments from almost every window of the tumble-down houses, and the great fate of intolerable noise which drowned the neighbouring bells of the two cathedrals. It's interesting to compare the occupational profiles of what might be called the Castle-Atticans and the others. Of the 62 with occupations who had Castle-Attican surnames, 26 were ice cream vendors, and another 21 were confectioners or shopkeepers. Only 2 of the Castle-Atticans were at that point fish and chip merchants, despite the piece of nostalgia I showed you a minute ago. The Castle-Atticans also were less likely to be labourers than non-Castle-Atticans, and they were also less likely to be white collar. The Jewish community at the outset was extremely close-knit and inward-looking, and as I've said elsewhere, rich in social capital. The Italians were also clannish, but they integrated, or some of them anyway, integrated more readily. Many of the Italian men recorded in 1911 had married out, including 6 of the 7 based in Cork. And this again is a big difference between the Belfast community and the rest. The Italians in Dublin and Cork, for the most part, married out. And they married women who were, as a rule, much younger than them. And it was a case of illiterate Italians marrying literate Irish women. So one wonders, did these Irish women did they see these Italians as good catches? And what does it tell you about the Irish men they spurned? Whereas in Belfast, Castle-Atticans married Castle-Atticans. Their kids spoke dialect, and the dialect lasted into the 3rd generation. So that once you go micro, as it were, you can see these subtle differences. We're inclined to think, and the Italian community today think, that they're all originally from Castle-Attico, and it's a bit more complex, a bit more nuanced than that. So in Chancery Lane, 7 of the 8 Italian male household heads living there in 1901 had married Irish women. Finally, both Italian and Jewish immigrations, like the much bigger reverse flow out of Ireland, were overwhelmingly economic in origin. Here is an account based on the experiences of Meyer Joel Wigeder, who would set up a highly successful paint and wallkeeper retailing business in Dublin. And he reminisced, "When my grandfather left Lithuania in 1891, his destination was Holland. His motivations for leaving home and family to start a new life elsewhere were entirely economic. As I read through his works of memoirs, I find no reference to any anti-Semitic experience or to the atmosphere of pogrom and persecution. Various business ventures had not succeeded, so at the age of 36, he left his pregnant wife and 4 children and headed west." It was likewise with another Dublin immigrant, Lieb Berman. A brother-in-law had set him up as a brewer in Lithuania, but he had made it so good that he lost heavily on every brew. The final straw was the spoilage of a cartload of fish on a sweltering day en route to the market in Vexna. His exasperated wife, hearing about a kinsman's success in Ireland, sent her husband packing. And the same goes for Louis Wine's journey to Ireland. His spur was a letter home from a stepbrother who, and I quote, having found his way to Ireland, wrote glowingly of the country, saying that he felt it was a land of great opportunity. As often happens, such matter-of-fact accounts do not square with collective or folk memory. But back to Mr. Deasy. Mr. Deasy's "She Never Let Them In," I think, is evidently far from the truth a century later. As noted, Ireland's immigrant inflow in the 2000s, sudden and enormous, was unmatched anywhere else in Western Europe. The evidence is all around us in Ireland. It is reflected in specialist shops and pubs, in the Tower of Babel that nowadays is a Dublin bus, in Dublin's packed Romanian Orthodox church last weekend, which was the Orthodox Easter, and which will surprise some on the playing fields of the Dublin GAA. This is a match report from the Irish Independent. About a week ago, Crumlin held on by 2 points with names which are clearly not Irish. And then you get photographs like these. This is Thomas Davis, which is a club in Tala. This is St. Luke's National School in Tyrrellstown. And this is Éireann go Bragh, which is a GA club in Clonee, just on the borders with County Meath. So not quite what the Citizen would have envisaged a century or so ago. But the acid test of Irish tolerance is not what happened in Mr. Deasy's day, but what is going on a century later. At first sight, the impact of immigration on Irish attitudes is curious and ambivalent. On the one hand, it has not, so far at least, given rise to the brand of xenophobic politics that is currently important, although some would say perhaps a little on the wane, across much of Europe. Ireland lacks a national front, a Northern League, or a Geert Wilders. And the established political parties, and I would include Sinn Féin in the list, have given a wide berth, again, one must emphasize, so far, to representatives seeking to capitalize on anti-immigrant sentiment. On the other hand, incidents of ill treatment meted out to Jewish and Italian immigrants a century ago pale into insignificance compared to those inflicted on some Irish immigrants in the recent past. In mid-June 2009, 20 Roma families, consisting of about 100 people, were forced out of their homes in the village area of South Belfast. Most of them returned to Romania, although by mid-July, they were waiting to hear if it was safe to return to Belfast, and I'm not sure whether some of them did return in the event or not. To my knowledge, nothing as violent was inflicted on immigrant communities a century ago, nor was any Italian or Jewish immigrant murdered for racist reasons. Now, no physical harm was inflicted on the Belfast Roma. But on a wet evening in January 2002, English language student and Chinese national 29-year-old Zhao Yutao was murdered in Beaumont in North Dublin on his way home from a night out. The BBC described this as Ireland's first racially motivated murder. In February 2008, 2 Polish migrant workers in their late 20s were murdered in Drimna. Over 2 years later, a youth from the area was found guilty of their murder. A 15-year-old of Nigerian origin from Tyrrellstown in West Dublin was murdered on the 2nd of April 2010 as he tried to stop an altercation. In March 2012, 3 men were jailed for killing a Polish national in Kulak in the north of the city on his way to work on the 2nd of October 2010. One of the culprits said they did it for a buzz. In November 2011, a Nigerian taxi driver was brutally attacked by a passenger on Dublin's Pearse Street. and died of his injuries a few days later. Some, I don't say all, of these murders were racially motivated. And of course, Mr. Deasy would have said, "I told you so." Nor has Northern Ireland been immune. In Carrickfergus in June 1996, the owner of a Chinese takeaway was robbed and murdered in an attack deemed racist by the police. And in Newry in July 2009, 40-year-old Marek Muzinski was the victim of a racially motivated murder. So there is that. It's also true that successive opinion polls point to significant anti-immigrant feeling. A September 2008 poll found that 2/3 of respondents wanted more restrictive legislation, whereas only 1/7 favoured less restrictive laws. And this provoked the Irish Examiner to editorialise, and I quote, "Our attitude towards immigrants may be about to face a sterner test than before. Let us hope we pass it." Another poll, just over a year later, reported a big majority of 72% wanting to see a reduction in the number of immigrants. Over 2/5 declared that they would like to see some, but not all, immigrants leave, while 29% would like to see most leave. And just 1 in 4 were happy to leave things as they stood. Now, further insight into immigration may be gained from the Irish National Election Study. This is a panel survey that was carried out by the Economic and Social Research Institute between 2002 and 2007. It was done to study voting behaviour, but there are some questions in there that can be used to address what we're interested in. And there are 3 questions which, or 4, which I highlight here. One had to do with whether there should be strict limits or not to immigration. And, people were allowed to answer on a scale from 0 to 7, kind of no controls to very strict controls and everything in between. And then there was a question about what kind of rights should asylum seekers be given, and the scale again represented being benignly sympathetic to being hostile. And there was a third question about culture, and whether immigrants should be forced to assimilate or whether their culture constituted a benefit. And the answers to all of these 3 questions were highly correlated. So people who didn't like multiculturalism wanted restrictive legislation and so on. But there was also a question about attitudes to travellers, and about whether travellers should have the right to live in halting sites. And it's interesting to find that people who are not favourably disposed to halting sites are also very anti-immigrant. So there's a sense in which it's not that people are specifically anti-immigrant, but they're against they're against something that's different. And this is something that you also find in, obviously, the question isn't answered here, but in the European Social Survey, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in a minute, there are similar questions about immigrants, but there's also a question about attitudes to gays and lesbians. And people who are narrow-minded on gays and lesbians also tend to be anti-immigrant. So there's a constellation of attitudes there, and xenophobia is part of it. Just being bigoted, being narrow-minded, not wanting things to be different is also, I think, part of the mix. These are correlation coefficients, and the numbers may look small, but for those who are interested, are actually quite big, because the number of observations is big. You're talking about 4,000 observations, so these are, to use the jargon, highly statistically significant. Now, again, there is a further complexity, and that is when you compare Ireland to other countries. The Irish are by no means at the top of the league table in being anti-immigrant. The Swedes, according to a survey carried out by the EU, so-called Eurobarometer survey, are the most favourably disposed, this is a few years ago now, to immigrants. And hostility to immigrants is very, very strong in the Czech Republic, in Cyprus, and in Latvia. And as you can see there, Ireland is somewhere in between. Now, one of the nice things about the European Social Survey is that it allows us to track trends in attitudes. There have been 5 waves so far, beginning in 2002. And these are 3 of the questions that are asked. And again, they range, they're qualitative questions, so people are asked to pick a number from 0 to 10 or 0 to 3, as the case may be. And you see, if you look at the first 2 columns of numbers here, by round, so this ranges from 2002 to 2010, you have to separate out Irish-born and other, because like I said, the others are a pretty high proportion of the population in Ireland, and they are bound to have different attitudes to immigration than, or likely to anyway, and that is what turns out. But what this suggests is that between waves 1 and 3, the Irish are becoming more enthusiastic about immigration. And then, since the bubble bust, less so. Okay, so that you see the number peaks here, 5.92, and drops back to 4. And the other answers reveal similar pattern. This is not very surprising. The shifts have not been that dramatic, but nevertheless, the direction is, I suppose, what one might expect. Now, again, this is taken from the European Social Survey, and its coverage is broader than Eurobarometer. So it includes surveys in some questions which are not part of the European Union. And so what you get in the scatter plot here is measures of 2 attitudes. One is being pro-immigrant. And the way to read this informally, Sweden is up there at the top, SE. And Swedes are the most benign of about 30 countries. And then out here on the horizontal axis, this is a measure of how people distinguish between immigrants who are like themselves and immigrants who are not. And so you find the Swedes, not only are they benignly disposed towards immigrants, but they don't care whether they're Norwegians or Turks. Now, I'm exaggerating a bit, but that is what this suggests. You move out here, Hungary and Cyprus. Not only do they not like immigration, but they are very hostile to migrants who are not Greek or who are not Hungarian or anyway like themselves in some way. And again, you see IL up there is Israel. And the Israelis they don't mind immigration too much, but they don't like the immigration of people who presumably are not Jewish. That's what this is saying. And then you can see that Portugal and Spain are also quite pro-immigration. Ireland is there, IE, and GB then is not that different from Ireland. Maybe a little bit less enthusiastic about immigrants than the Irish are. I should say too that one can do some econometric analysis with this information, and I'm in the process of doing that, but I don't have any solid results to report here, other than to say that people who are well educated tend to be less hostile to immigrants, but you have to worry about that. Is that because they don't live near them? They don't live in Tyrrellstown or wherever. But unfortunately, the European Social Survey does not allow you to control for geography. It would be great if it did. And then, there are other patterns that emerge. People who vote on the left tend to be more benign towards immigration. That's not that surprising, I suppose. There is another aspect of Irish attitudes to immigration that I might mention here very briefly in a comparative context, and that is Eurobarometer asks people every 6 months or so. They conduct surveys and they say, what issues bother you most at the moment? And these might range from the quality of healthcare to the quality of education, to global warming, to immigration, unemployment, inflation, housing, and what have you. And the Irish answers are interesting in that immigration rarely features. It's not something that people worry about compared to post, say, 1908 unemployment and the condition of the economy. Whereas in other countries, and I've graphed that, but I don't want to show too many graphs, there are several other countries where people worry more about immigration than the Irish do. So the story so far is clearly there is some hostility, but the issue doesn't bulk as large as it does elsewhere. It is not an important issue in political discourse yet. This may change. Now, let me move on to very quickly what is called Friedman's dilemma. Friedman, this is Milton Friedman, the late Nobel Prize-winning economist, pointed out that it would be impossible for countries to have two things: a generous welfare system and free immigration. He said, if the welfare system is very, very generous, then people will freeload, and this will put great pressure on governments either to keep people out or to make welfare more stringent. And of course, Friedman, who didn't like the welfare state, said, well, immigration is good because it'll reduce the size of the state. But then there are people on the left and in the center left who try to square the circle and say, how can we have a fairly open attitude to immigration without compromising the welfare state? So that is a difficult issue, because when you ask people about immigration, one of the main fears they have about immigration is migrants taking advantage of the system. And it's clear that these fears are greatly exaggerated, just like people's fears of immigrants committing crime. In fact, immigrants give more to the exchequer than they take back. And that has been shown generally across Europe in the last few decades. But the fear is, and the fear, of course, is important, that is not the case. So a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment is born of this kind of fear. And this means that one must identify and minimize abuse. I mean, if there is abuse, and it's fairly small scale, nevertheless, it's being used by people who are maybe xenophobic, and you really want to not give them the excuse to do so. So, let me talk about one case study in Ireland, a somewhat notorious one, on which I have some new evidence to show you. In 2004, Ireland passed a referendum, the so-called citizenship referendum, which was quite controversial, although the majority in favour of it was very, very large. But there was a great deal of discussion beforehand as to what this was doing. And the reason for the perceived need for the referendum was the sense that some immigrant groups were abusing the Irish Constitution. And in particular, one group singled out were Nigerians. And Nigerian mothers in particular wanting to have their babies born in Ireland, which would mean that the children would be Irish citizens, and which would make it difficult by extension for the state to remove their parents. So there was a strong sense that this was going on. Now, this sense was heightened by complaints from the masters of the 3 main maternity hospitals in Dublin, who said that, their services were being put under tremendous pressure, and that immigrant mothers were in large part responsible. The story goes back, of course, to a judgment in the 1980s by an immigrant couple, a Nigerian man and his, I think, Moroccan wife, and they claimed the right to stay in Ireland on the basis that their child was Irish born, and they won that right, and others began to see the possibilities. And by January 2000, Peter McKenna, master of the Dublin Rotunda Hospital, expressed wonder at how women, and I'm quoting him here, mainly Nigerians, but also Eastern Europeans, can manage to travel halfway across the world pregnant and walk in the door to us at 39 weeks. He was, and I quote, past the stage of being surprised at the number of refugees giving birth in Ireland, but he had no doubt whatsoever that the system was being exploited. The head of Gráda immigration in Dún Laoghaire explained, and I quote, they're coming in very close to birth and seem to be waiting until the very last minute to make the trip over. Most of them would be 7 or 8 months pregnant and can be very distressed. It would look like they are coming here to have their baby and get Irish citizenship. Now, in April 2002, the High Court overturned the decision I mentioned earlier. And in January 2003, the Supreme Court upheld this verdict. And this meant that Irish-born children could be deported with their non-citizen parents unless the latter agreed to be deported alone. Then this ruling was superseded by the referendum, which sundered the link between birth in Ireland and citizenship. So this was the definition, of course, that Leopold Bloom had of being Irish. What is it? What does being I was born here, I'm Irish? So the constitutional right to citizenship would be restricted to those with at least one parent who is an Irish citizen or entitled to be an Irish citizen. The 1937 Constitution embodied, unknowingly of course, Leopold Bloom's response to the citizen's barbed question in Ulysses, "What is your nation, if I may ask?" To which Bloom replied, "Ireland. I was born here. Ireland." In the eyes of those who enacted and supported the referendum, welfare tourism made the definition powerless. The rhetoric of the referendum campaign pitted good immigrants who came to Ireland to work against bad immigrants who sought to take advantage of its welfare regime. Now, to what extent was the situation in the hospitals like Master McKenna claimed? Well, the answer is as follows, and this is based on data which obviously I got anonymized, taken from one of the hospitals, and I'm not at liberty to say which. And this is looking at Irish-born mothers. And I've simply broken the observations down into segments of women who came less than a month before giving birth, 30 to 50 days, 50 to 150, and then over 200. And you can see, and then Y99 to Y, these are years. So each graph represents a year. And you see that very, very few Irish women leave it late. You can see here there is some change, and I'm not sure exactly why that happened, but there is some change in 2005 or 2006 where the vast majority of women, as soon as they know they're pregnant, they go to the hospital and they say, look, I want to tell you and I'm going to give birth here. So that is the situation. And this is for British-born women. And, it's very similar, identical. So just remember these now. And these, Chinese-born women, same. Very, very few come to the hospital late in the day. But these are the Nigerians. So you can see there, on the eve of the referendum, 40 to 50% are coming less than a month before, and then most are coming within a few months of giving birth. So there's a very strong pattern. And the other thing is that once the referendum is passed, the pattern is changed to something very like the Irish and the Chinese and the British pattern. So there's no doubt but that there was abuse going on. I mean, we can't hide that. And my point is that it's better to close these kind of loopholes and not allow people who hate immigrants to use what is, after all, something, a minority thing to affect the immigrant population as a whole. Then these are Romanian, and these diagrams jump around a bit because, the number of observations isn't as big. But there is some suggestion there, too, of women showing up late in the day. And after the referendum, there's a very radical shift. Again, other Africans, they are not as pronounced as the Nigerians. And again, why the Nigerians are so different tells us something about immigrant networks. And maybe some of these Nigerians come from places that had links with Ireland, in the past. And that in itself is rather interesting. But again, and then these are Ukrainians, and I just grouped them all together before and after, and you can see that there is quite and Russians, and there is quite a difference in the patterns. And it's not only that the patterns changed, the numbers also were affected. The numbers of Nigerian women in the wake of the 2004 referendum dropped. Now, it is tempting to see a link also between the referendum and that Supreme Court decision and a reduction in the number of applications for asylum. This is the story of Ireland and applications for asylum. And these are in 3 monthly chunks so that I could bring the data bang up to date to January, March 2013. And you see that the number of applications plummets in 2003, 2004. And you might say, well, this is simply a byproduct of the referendum. But I think if you assume that, you'd be wrong, because if you look at what's happening in Britain and in Ireland, the patterns are uncannily similar. And I think this has more to do with Fortress Europe across the EU than anything specifically Irish. I think Ireland's a small country, and I think insofar as applications for asylum were concerned, the Irish pattern followed what you see elsewhere. With, I suppose, the rider that this drop here, this marked drop, one might want to link that to the collapse of the economy post-2007. Again, if you look at the data across Europe, there are some other countries in Europe where the number of asylum seekers has not fallen. But it's down now to a real trickle in the Irish case. Now, it will seem like I'm singling out the poor Nigerians, and it is true that they differ from the East European immigrants and also from some Asian immigrants in important ways. A recent study by Feldman, Gilmartin, Miga and Loyal, these are Dublin-based academics, of immigration from India, China, Nigeria and Lithuania, finds that Nigerians' recourse to medical care exceeded that of the other three nationalities by a wide margin. The Nigerians also felt most discriminated against of the four groups, and I'm sure they're right in this. Yet paradoxically or not, they were also most determined to remain. The others said, yeah, we'll go home eventually. Most of the Nigerians said, no, we're staying put. We're here for the long haul, even though they feel most discriminated against. Moreover, the 2006 census revealed that the labour force participation rate of Nigerian immigrants was far lower than that of other immigrant groups, and you'd see that here. These data were not lost on Irish independent journalist Kevin Myers, who, when it comes to the issue of immigration, is rather a rabble-rouser, and who demanded, and I quote, "Why are so many people from a country to which we have no moral or legal or historical obligations living off this state? Why are they being allowed through immigration if they have no jobs to go to? Why are they choosing to come to Ireland when 20 countries or more lie between their homeland and ourselves? And finally, and perhaps most important of all, why is no one else asking why? Why did no one else pick up the immigration digest so thoughtfully provided by the Central Statistics Office? Is it because we are too polite, too timid, or too stupid?" So, like I say, rabble-rousing stuff. But what Myers overlooks here is that many of the Nigerians, unlike the Poles and the Lithuanians, were not allowed to work. Moreover, 5 years on, while Nigerians are still outliers as regard labour force participation and unemployment, they are far less so now than they were in 2006. So the gap, if you like, between the Latvians and the Poles on the one hand and the Nigerians on the other is huge in 2006, but in 2011 they're not all that different, and they're becoming like everybody else. Now, there are also a few other points to be made here. These are more, I suppose, points that an economist might make. Because the economics of migration suggests that it's hardly surprising that immigrants from countries like Nigeria, where living standards are a fraction of what they are in Ireland, should be less inclined to move on in bad times than immigrants from, say, Poland or Lithuania, for whether the decision to stay or go is more marginal. Second, there is a presumption, given the significant costs involved, that immigrants from poor, distant countries will be highly motivated and highly educated. And that is what we know of the educational status of immigrants tells us. So here, if you look first of all at the East Europeans, they are not that educated. True, Poles, fair few with postgraduate education. But the Latvians are overwhelmingly blue-collar workers. You look then at India and the Philippines, and there's a very high proportion of people with ordinary university degrees. You look at Nigeria, very poor country, and South Africa, and 10% have some postgraduate qualification. So these are immigrants who are not the poorest of the poor in their own country and arrive in Ireland sometimes with skills which are not transferable or not immediately transferable. But they're also people who are quite ambitious to get their kids well educated and, who have, if you like, aspirational values of a type that some politicians in this jurisdiction talk about. So, concluding thoughts. In their attitude to immigrants, are the Irish any different? Mr. Deasy's jibe more than a century ago was that they thought they were different, but this was only because the challenges they faced were different. In Ireland, there is no room for complacency, and the threats and hostilities endured by, in particular, Nigerian and Roma immigrants today dwarf, I would argue, those faced by Italians and Jews a century or so ago. At the same time, there is a role for initiatives that minimize and preempt friction between native and newcomer, and there is a case for seeing the 2004 citizenship referendum in that light. There is a case, too, I would argue, for transparency about the facts. Research elsewhere comparing perceptions and reality suggests that public opinion has an exaggerated and distorted impression of immigration's impact on unemployment, living standards, welfare tourism, and crime. I should mention here maybe that recently I did some work on Italian emigration and immigration and looked at an opinion poll on attitudes to immigration, where one of the questions people were asked was, what proportion of the population are immigrants? And what proportion of the immigrants are illegal? And the answers were way out of sync with reality. You know, people believed that the immigrants were a far, far higher proportion of the population than the 5 or 6% they really are. And in the same way, most of the immigrants are legal. Only a very, very small proportion are illegal, whereas the perception is that a very significant share of the immigrants are illegal. So my point is that one needs to broadcast this information and maybe in the process, hopefully, change attitudes. In October 2007, in one of his most extreme declarations about immigration, a contrarian columnist, already mentioned, warned in the Irish Independent. And wait, where is my page? I have to finish with this quotation if I can find it. Yes, here we are. The bridge stands unmanned as Lars Porsena's legions approach, and this time there is no Horatio. Ireland as Ireland is about to vanish, just as Leicester, Bradford, Luton, Rotterdam, etc. have already done. Fare thee well, Enniskillen and Erin's Green Isle. 6 years later, there were no signs that Ireland had vanished, although the country had changed for the worse for other well-known reasons. And as a result, net immigration, which was a sign of the good times and which Kevin Myers implied would continue at pace indefinitely, has turned into net emigration on a considerable scale. The turnaround at its most dramatic is reflected in the number of immigrants from the EU 12. 85,000 in 2007, 10,000 in 2012. As the economy continues to stagnate and welfare regimes tighten, there is no reason to believe that this pattern will not continue. So, Gurmil Mahagov, thanks a lot.
Thanks very much. There are some people outside who want to serve us glasses of wine. And they're able to do this thanks to the generosity of the Irish Embassy, which has always supported this series of lectures, but also intellectual and cultural life in Irish matters in London more generally. But before we do that, could we just thank Cormac again for a fascinating survey of immigrants in Ireland and attitudes to immigrants in Ireland from Mr. DC to Kevin Myers. Thank you.